Hi, Ben. Thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Andy, a great pleasure. Good to see you.
Good to see you again. It wasn't that long ago that we were together. Of course, you were a judge at the HMO Awards. You, I would say, were kind of really at the front of the campaign against the Renters Reform Bill, which I think is a really good place for us to start this conversation today. But before we do, I'm sure a lot of our listeners will know about you, Ben, and what you do, but perhaps for some of them who don't, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your sort of background, maybe as a landlord, and then your kind of role at, NRLA?
Yeah, with pleasure, Andy. So I'm first and foremost a landlord. I've been a landlord despite my youthful and beautiful looks for over 20 years. I'm starting to get little gaps in my hairline to prove it. I've always worked in housing. I started off in lettings and property management. I joined the deposit scheme in 2008 TDS, where I was doing sort of casework stuff. I then went on to head up membership, become customer service director. So I'm used to working with lots of agents and landlords and can kind of see things from various vantage points. And I also headed up the complaints and risk process. I was dealing a lot with tenants, and we were processing at the time 15,000 adjudications a year. So it was a serious operation. Set up the schemes in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I left just as we were appointed a custodial scheme in England. I then joined Places for People, a big housing association, where I was looking after some of the biggest corporate landlords in the UK. We had 22,000 homes under management. So some of your high street landlords like Ladbrokes, Tesco, British Heart Foundation, those were my clients, and also the Wellcome Trust. And I also looked after some build-to-rent units in Liverpool at the Keel. So I had offices in Scotland, Milton Keynes, Bath, Central London, and Leeds. So it was a big operation. And after sort of 2 or 3 years, there was rumours going around of the NRLA and the RLA merging. And I had a chat at a housing conference with the then chair, Alan Ward, who suggested I put my hat in the ring. And that was astonishingly 5.5 years ago. And so I haven't really had a chance to look back since. It's been seat of the pants. And my role at the NRLA really is predicated on giving landlords a voice, a sensible voice, a pragmatic voice to power, but also about providing great services, and leveraging our size to get the best possible deals, the best possible products for our members, and to talk up the work that they do. I'm sure there's lots of people that would like me to do things differently, but membership has grown 35% since the merger, since I've taken over. We've acquired different businesses like Safe2, the property compliance business. We're cooking on gas when it comes to training and accreditation, and have obviously kind of branched out on commercial services. So we've got over 50 partnerships now. So my job is to keep everything together, and we've got, I think, 140 people on the payroll. So it's now a very significant operation. And as I say, it's predicated on making sure that we speak truth to power, but always that we're in the room to be able to convey the views of our members.
And am I right in thinking, Ben, you have sort of in the region of about 100,000 members?
108,000 now.
108, wow. I mean, it's a huge number of people and a big organisation and a lot of responsibility. I mean, I am staggered sometimes to see how active you are and are able to remain, and the last couple of years have been a bit of a whirlwind. When you took this role, decided to embark on it, did you foresee perhaps how turbulent the last few years would be? I mean, you've been in the role 5 years and it's been pretty bonkers. I mean, just as a landlord and investor, I can only imagine from your seat what that has felt like. Did you foresee that, in the way that it's kind of panned out and it being as challenging as it has?
I was young, naive, and without a care in the world. If I look back now and think all of the crap that we've been through, Jesus, it's been absolutely mad, because I started in October 2019. When the merger was imminent, and it took forever and ever and ever. And then, then we had COVID and didn't see each other for, 18 months or whatever. So it was very, very, difficult, different. I mean, in some respects, it might have made it slightly easier, I don't know, but, just sort of operational stuff. 2 websites to one, 2 back ends into one, 2 call centers into one, dealing with all of the people side as well. Yeah, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for, and I have no idea what's going to happen, for the next year or so. But I think I know property very well, and I enjoy property. I've always enjoyed housing, and I think we've got a good story to tell. on behalf of our members, and that's what we're going to carry on doing.
Well, you've obviously got a huge amount of experience across the sector, Ben. So, it's great to be able to have this conversation with you today. And I said a good jump-off point today, although you're probably sick of hearing it, is the Renters Reform Bill. Now, I think it's going to be really difficult, and I'll do my best to remain sort of apolitical today. But we are, of course, on the cusp of sort of a new government, and housing is so political in this country, And I guess my first question is the Renters Reform Bill. We had a chat a little while before the snap election was called, and I distinctly remember you saying, like, it really has to happen now, otherwise there's a risk that it's not going to happen. You campaigned, and a lot of people campaigned very, very strongly, and there were a number of amendments. And to be honest, my opinion was it could have been a lot worse, and actually what it was probably not going to be that difficult to deal with, and it seemed like a reasonable scenario to go through. And of course, that has all sort of ended up being put to the side for a minute. Was that disappointing for you guys at the NRLA? And what do you think that the prospect of a new government, whoever that may be, now looks like in terms of this bill coming forwards, and whether or not it might be amended for better or for worse?
Well, I think we were disappointed, and I know there's a lot of people that were pleased that the Renters Reform Bill fell, but obviously it's going to come back. It's just a question of how it comes back. And all that does, Andy, is really sort of lend uncertainty to the sector, which is not what we need. My feeling is that the bill was probably about as good as we could get it. In fact, the day before the election was called, I was with Baroness Swinburne, who's the minister in the Lords, who said, you've actually done pretty well to get it to here. The only way is down from here. And actually, we were supporting her, talking to a number of peers that very afternoon to basically leave the bill alone and to get it through. Obviously, then the election was called, and there were, I think, 7 bills that made it through wash-up. What I know is that both Labour and Conservatives eventually supported the bill with the amendments that we had. So there was an opportunity for it to go through. There wasn't enough time for it to go through. Gove decided to take the leasehold and freehold bill through, and the Renters Reform Bill fell. What I think we have to do now, and you will see this in our campaigning in the coming days, is, assuming the polls are correct and that we have a Labour government, well, Labour have made a number of commitments in the run-up to the election. What our angle here is to build on the consensus that was achieved during wash-up and actually pass a bill that is broadly palatable for most people, and not let perfect be the enemy of the good. However, what they decide to do if and when they get into power may not. I think it will possibly be a short, sharp bill that just abolishes Section 21. Whether that's done under emergency legislation or whether it's done as part of the political process remains to be seen. But I don't think we will then, if that happens, we won't see it sort of contingent on a number of other things that we were successful at, like court reform, like a 2-phased implementation, things that would give people time to adjust to the change. And obviously, our wider concern here is not that this change is inevitable. It's just what form it comes in. But actually, it won't do anything substantive to deal with the core issues at play here, which are lack of confidence, lack of supply, and demand outstripping supply, and therefore resulting in very, very high rents. So we do need to push the future government to really kind of embrace the private rented sector. £45 billion contribution to the economy. Rachel Reeves understands that. So how do you protect that, and how do you get others to kind of invest in a way that delivers it on some of the things that you've said in the run-up to the election? I think it's going to be a very, very interesting time, which is why I've taken a couple of days off this week so that I'm in London from the 1st of July for the whole summer to make sure that the views of our members can be conveyed, because I think that things will move quite quickly.
So can I take from that then that in all likelihood we think that the bill will probably come through and look very similar, and we would be surprised to see any significant amendments either way, better or worse, to kind of how it was looking before it was kind of dropped, paused?
I mean, that's the hope, Andy, and that's what the campaigning is on. but you've only got to look at the amendments that were suggested to see where the opposition or the current opposition were thinking in terms of any changes. And so our argument is, let's not undo the consensus that has been arrived at. Let's get the bill through and reinvigorated based on the consensus that was broadly achieved, and let's not tinker with it too much. However, this very much depends on, how Labour come to power, if they come to power. If it is a very significant majority, as is being forecast, then, well, there won't necessarily be a lot to stop them doing more. I have to be careful what I say now, but to be doing more challenging things. And, we've heard some of the rhetoric in recent days and weeks, haven't we? So I'm going to keep my powder dry a little bit, but it's fair to say if they do get a very big majority, I think they can be far more bullish in how that bill is then brought forward. Because Angela Rayner has been very clear about Section 21 and, doing it as soon as possible on day one, all of those types of things. Well, there is a process to go through and it will need to fit in with the parliamentary timetable. But I'm sure that what you could do is strip Section 21 out of that bill and just have a short, sharp bill that deals with Section 21. Don't worry about the Ombudsman. Don't worry about the property portal. Don't worry about this, that and the other. Just deal with Section 21. Job done.
Why do you think that property is so political in this country? And you're in France at the minute. You spend a bit of time in France. It doesn't seem to be the case, across the rest of Europe where property is used as such a political tool. But it does feel, and maybe I feel, maybe that's a bit of a victim mentality as a landlord, and I would like it all to be, hunky-dory. But it does seem, and this word uncertainty that you used, I would say that has very much characterized the last at least 5 years, as far as I can remember, for a whole host of reasons. Is that just a very British thing? Is it the British way? And is it because there is this divide in class, or maybe North and South divide? Is there something more deeply rooted that is driving a lot of this stuff, which actually is more of the fundamental problem than anything else? Because the Conservatives have not been very conservative in the last government. They've really not been very friendly to landlords, and that has been incredibly disappointing to see, I think. And I do wonder whether any of what we're doing now is really going to change the long-term sort of outcome of how landlords and investors and the private rental sector will be looked at and treated into the distant future.
Well, you're right. The Conservative government have taken landlords for granted and they've given them a good kicking. And it's only in the last sort of 18 months or so they've realised that actually you need landlords, you need investor confidence. You're not going to be able to deliver on some of the things that you've promised to deliver on. And so we've seen a marked change from Michael Gove and others, but too little too late. And it's a warning to the next government as well, that I think you have to think far more holistically about housing solutions. You've got to look at housing as a multifaceted sort of component, social housing, private housing, build-to-rent housing, owner-occupier. You're not going to be able to just build social housing for everybody. We have to do away with this, silly ideology. Yeah, sure, good thing. Let's invest in social housing. Let's build more social housing. Let's stop flogging it off for a start, or at least make sure that we replace that stock and perhaps are slightly less generous with the discounts, because that is one of the things that has adversely affected where we find ourselves at the moment, where, we've got over 1 million people on social housing waiting lists. We are very reliant on private landlords kind of taking people on benefits. We've got local authorities that are, outbidding each other to attract private landlords. Well, that's a bit mad. That is a little bit mad. I don't think anybody could think that is a really good thing. So we do have a massive shortage of housing. And as a result, I think that this perceived inequality, isn't there? If I was 18 or 19 now and looking at buying a house or even renting, I don't know whether I would be able to afford it. I do share that, the anger, and it is anger, that young people are really, really feeling it. They're saddled with debt if they've been to university. I don't know that it's always been this difficult, to be honest with you. But the solution isn't, to kick the people who are perceived to be better off, because we know that actually, it's very marginal to be renting your property. Savills record profits at sub 4%, their lowest since 2008, I think it was, or 2007. And so, we mustn't think that just because you happen to have a property or two, that somehow, you're hoarding properties, you're preventing people from being able to buy. That's not right. And also, I think that what recent episodes and reports have sort of shown is that social housing isn't quite the panacea that everybody feels that it is. And this idea of a very, very big landlord, it's bloody difficult to manage 20 odd thousand homes. And stuff goes wrong. And so, dare I say it, bigger isn't always better. You can spread your risk by actually, yes, encouraging people in institutions to build. But of course, let's remember, government doesn't actually build anything. They just create the environment for homes to be built. We've missed those targets year on year. So these targets that have been promised, 1.5 million over the course of the next Parliament by Labour, 1.6 just to be contrary from the Tories over the next Parliament, 300-ish thousand homes a year. Well, that's never been met. And actually, with the cost of living crisis and the cost of materials and that sort of stuff, it's very, very expensive. And whether you are a private landlord or a social landlord, you kind of need it to wash its face, otherwise you're not going to bother. So that's profit isn't a dirty word, it's a realistic word. Otherwise, why bother? So I think we do need to move away from, whilst I understand the anger, actually pitting one side against the other is not helpful. The Tories have failed miserably at this. Creating a class war is not the solution here.
No, and I think you only need to look, up towards Scotland and across to Ireland to see actually what can happen if, you continue to meddle. And there's been talk of things like, rent controls, and we can see whether that's been done. Actually, it hasn't really done what anyone hoped to do. It's ultimately just driven prices up. And I think a lot of what you've talked about, and I share this, the interventions that the governments have made, tax changes and additional legislation. And for me, the Renters Reform Bill was just another piece. It was framed as this idea of making the private rental sector fairer for everybody, but I really failed to see what it was actually doing for me as a landlord who feels like he already provides good quality accommodation. I appreciate that some tenants maybe don't get a fair deal, but equally some landlords, I think, feel like they don't get a fair deal. And for me, all of that additional legislation and the attention that's being detracted from these problems, some of which you just mentioned, has ultimately meant that the cost of running businesses, they have to be run like businesses to provide a good customer service and be reactive to tenants, has become increasingly difficult. And it, to me, seems quite obvious that actually, I'm not sure incentivizing landlords is necessarily the word, but actually supporting landlords to produce and run good, profitable businesses and actually maintain a good and healthy supply could actually bring property values and certainly rental prices down a little bit. And while it's only going to touch the edges, I'm sure there's bigger problems we need to talk about. But for me, that seems to be a potential solution. And I do wonder who's keeping an eye on that. And then I also wonder, this is perhaps a question for you, Ben, what do you think as a landlord on the ground, and particularly as a HMO investor, and a lot of our listeners obviously invest in HMOs, what can we be doing here to sort of maybe manage this as best as we possibly can if we're looking ahead and we can see that it's not likely to change, or these views are not likely to change in the short term, but equally, there's still going to be a huge demand for housing. Are HMOs a good solution? Because it doesn't seem to get spoken about much. And then, in fact, maybe something to come back to. It does seem like there were a couple of things in the Renters Reform Bill that were actually quite intentional to try and squeeze some HMO investors, particularly in the big city locations where there's a lot of students. But what would your opinion be on HMOs and how and what their role could be within this wider problem that we've got?
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all is the word, isn't it? When you think of HMOs, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to thinking about nice things. And it's the same with landlord. And we discussed this at the HMO Awards. I think we probably need a bit of a rebrand. And that's certainly something that the NRLA is going to be releasing in the autumn, say it here, but to kind of broaden its appeal to a more varied property professional, but also make it very clear that we are championing the private rented sector. The private rented sector is a good thing. Yes, of course, there's elements to it that can be improved, but actually you've got people within the private rented sector who are very passionate about it, who are very keen for it to succeed, and who want to go over and above what's expected of them. And we want to be able to support that endeavour. So that's why we're going to be rebranding in the autumn. September, I think, is when we'll be releasing it. So I think for me, it's also about recognising, yes, okay, there's some elements of our industry that could do better. And actually, dealing with those issues head on. You won't hear me defend every landlord. You'll hear me hang some landlords out to dry who, bring the sector into disrepute. We can't defend the indefensible, but we can champion and talk up those that are doing the right thing. And that's, very much incumbent on us as an organisation, on me as a key sort of spokesperson, but it's also incumbent on individuals. As I said at the HMO Awards, don't be afraid to approach your elected representatives about your concerns. Tell us about your concerns as well. But actually, renter groups are very good at sort of mobilising and, creating urgency about the situation. We're all on the same page. We all recognise there's a housing emergency. It's no good to me having 15 people apply to rent one of my properties, because then I, will get accused of discriminating against somebody who's on benefits or whatever it happens to be. You know what? I just want to choose the least risky tenant who presents their credentials in a way that's going to sustain a tenancy. I'm not interested in anything else. I'm not encouraging bidding wars. And, Starmer is never going to be able to deal with bidding wars unless he deals with the fundamental issues of supply. So, we have to think very, very holistically, I think. We've also got to make sure that as individuals, we talk up what we're doing. And if there's one thing that people take away from today's podcast is, when we have a government confirmed, when we have elected representatives, write to them, tell them what you're doing, tell them what your concerns are. Yes, you can use the toolkit on the NRLA site, but stick it in your own words, copy us in. Let's get some movement.
I think some great advice there, and certainly something that we're finding from our community, which is probably over about 10,000 members. I think that collective voice and that support and being able to answer the questions and share ideas and advice and guidance with one another is helping a lot of people. I do have a direct question for you, though, Ben. I've taken myself back I've not been in the game quite as long as you, but the best part of 20 years. And I, very green, very few sort of concerns in the world. And actually, it was part of that naivety that probably allowed me to sort of build quite a successful business in the end. And I think now that I would, in the current climate, it would be so different. It would be much more challenging. I'm not sure whether I'd really have the kind of the balls to do it, if I'm quite honest. Do you think to be a landlord now, you almost have to be a professional landlord? Because there were historically, and there still are, but a lot of accidental landlords, people who just kind of fallen into it, or it was quite easy or easier to do, perhaps, through the 90s as Blair was in. Do you think times have changed? Are we beyond that now? Do we have to think radically different as a landlord, as an investor, if we want to succeed?
Well, I think as an investor, there are certainly more pitfalls now than they once were. And there's such a focus on housing now that, I don't think you can afford to be an amateur. I don't know whether an amateur landlord actually exists. I think you're either, you either consider yourself as a business or you're a bit ignorant to, the mood music around you, really. I don't think that you can afford to be in that sort of amateur category. And so that's why professional support is so important. You need to have access to an advice line when things go wrong. You need to make sure that your documents are up to date. You need to manage your compliance. All boring stuff, right? But actually really, really important basic stuff that will undermine your investment if you get it wrong. I mean, it really is as simple as that. So I think the environment is very different to how it was, certainly when I was investing. But you know what? The rewards are still there. I think you just have to be far more diligent about how you go about it. And you will have to just embrace the fact that there is more regulation than everybody would like, and that more regulation will be coming. I mean, I can't make it go away. All I can do, we can do, is to effectively make it as palatable as possible for investors to continue, and to make the argument that if you do make something too difficult, too punitive, not rewarding enough, well, you're not going to get the homes that you need in the first place. So we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater on some of this stuff. Yes, it's still a great thing to invest in. Is it as good as it was 10 and 15 years ago? No, but what is?
I think that there's a good sermon. And I found myself saying more and more as well that I think managing our own expectations as landlords and as investors has become increasingly important. You've got to work harder for the same returns. You've got to work more for the same returns. There is more admin, there's more paperwork. If you don't want to be a busy fool, then you need the appropriate systems and processes and people to help you do all of that. Unfortunately, it's not an industry now, and I think there are just too many moving parts to be able to sit back and put your feet up entirely.
Right.
Which I think is still the kind of the hopeful and wishful thinking behind building a property business. And as rewarding as and as great as it can be, personally, I don't think that that's actually really why somebody should get into this business. I think if you want to build a business that maybe one day is hands off and can let you put your feet up, there's different types of businesses to build. Property's probably not the one to do that.
But remember, what we have now is we've got far greater technology to be able to manage our portfolios in a way that, dare I say it, we perhaps didn't have 15 or 20 years or so ago. So I think things are better in some regards. You can manage compliance more effectively, but you're right. You've got to have the right sort of systems. You've got to know what to tap into. And that sort of support network is, worth its weight in gold.
Ben, this has been a really interesting conversation. The next 5 years, irrespective of who comes in, what government we're under, what do you think it'll look like for the PRS? And, if you are hopeful and some of your sort of objectives and missions, were achievable, what would you hope to see happen over the next 5 years for the industry as a whole?
So I'd hope that we do see the investment in social housing that we need, but that it isn't to the detriment of the private rented sector, because in reality, we need both, right? So if a future government is saying that the way they're going to deal with the shortage of housing supply is to invest in social housing, well, that's fine. But let's not do silly things like convert PRS property into social housing, because that's not adding to the overall net supply of homes. We need to see actual increases. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is I think we will inevitably see more regulation and a more stricter framework of operating. We will see an abolition to Section 21. We will see things be made more difficult, I think. And our job is to make sure that whatever Section 21 abolition looks like, that we've always been focused on the alternative being effective and working. And that's what we will absolutely focus on, because we mustn't forget our country does not really support rent dodgers and people that are antisocial. And so there's a great opportunity there to be on the right side of the argument. I don't want my kids being woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning because next door's a knocking shop and I can't do anything about it. Actually, that's not what the majority feel. So yes, we're in a very, very different world. I think we're in a very different world, but some of the fundamentals will remain. And I think we've got to push that argument, particularly in the context of Section 21, particularly in the context of antisocial behaviour and rent arrears. And that's something, as a HMO landlord predominantly, I haven't had rent arrears for ages. I've had loads of rent arrears this year, and I've had people mucking about, and I self-manage as well. So they've all got something over me. If I do something wrong or get a bit uppity, then, I'm going to go to the paper or whatever. But luckily I haven't had quite that, but it is more difficult. And, even in the student world, which has been, for me, relatively easy, it is becoming more difficult. And I think that what we can't do is acquiesce to all of the extreme calls that we're hearing. We've got to keep to the centre ground, and that's what we're working hard to do.
I've got one final question for you, Ben, and this might be the $1 million question, but social housing, part of perhaps the solution. We've talked about other ideas today, but you've also shared this target, 1.5, 1.6 million homes, that we need, they want to deliver, and we've heard it before, haven't we? What do you think needs to happen to get anywhere near hitting these targets? Because on a fundamental level, I think that really the only way to make the biggest change is actually to deal with that. Do you think that's all the majority through social housing, or actually do we need to take a different approach with developers? And I ask this question as a developer who takes extraordinarily large risks which of course need to be appropriately rewarded. But it is exceptionally difficult sometimes to just get the projects to a point where you can even begin. So your thoughts on that, I think, would be interesting to hear.
So my thoughts are, and I'm not a developer, Andy, but I think, I've had enough experience with local authorities, particularly recently, to know that, let's be kind.
We don't have to be, Ben.
I do.
Not for us.
That I think there should be a bit more pragmatism when it comes to sort of local authority interpretation and planning. And, rather than kind of err on the side of caution, actually, I'd go a little bit more the other way. So I think there are significant issues with planning and delays and that sort of thing. And it does stem to local authority resourcing and cuts. So that would be the first thing that I say. The second thing is, we're very precious about the green belt, and it's quite interesting to see, Starmer talk about potentially building on the green belt. But I think there needs to be far more kind of incentives to be able to bring commercial buildings back into use, for example. And I also think that if government are to deliver on their targets, they are going to have to make some changes, because if they don't, these targets have failed to be met for years, year after year after year. So something has to be done differently. One of the other things is sort of opportunity, though. So if we're talking about social housing, I'd love to sort of see private landlords come together, like as a REIT or something, who might be able to collectively invest in social housing. That would show private landlords in a different light, and that's certainly one of the things that I'm looking at the moment, how we might be able to diversify our investments through our kind of people power. That might be something we could consider, but for sure something has to be fundamentally different. And often you see this, we're going to free up planning, and nothing actually happens. People are going to have to get used to buildings in their villages and towns, and it's difficult to accept.
It is, and I guess you and I and everybody else will just have to wait and see, because the real question is, I think we all agree with you, Ben, there is, will they do anything about it? Will they actually take affirmative action and make some changes to the planning system? But let's wait and see. I haven't heard anything about it that's really kind of piqued my attention. Yeah. And that's the bit that concerns me.
And that's the thing with all of this, yes, we know the headline, yes, we know the issues, but what are the actual policy positions? What are the small tweaks that you're going to make that collectively will make a big difference? And of course, we won't find that out until they work them out and are in power, I guess. So there's a great opportunity, though, to influence, which is why I say, getting involved with your elected representative once confirmed is really, really important, because we are part of the solution here. We may not be viewed as it just yet, but we are part of the solution, and we can really help government deliver on its aspirations and really help the private rented sector give the homes it needs to people, because we're in desperate shortage at the moment.
Ben, this has been a really interesting conversation, especially from somebody who has the unique sort of vantage point that you have across the PRS and the conversations and the rooms that you are able to get into. So we really appreciate your time. For anyone listening today who perhaps wants to hear more from you, maybe see more from you, any conferences, events, or anything that they can be keeping an eye out for?
You can follow me on social media, although I'm quiet at the moment at the request of my press team. But we have a full program of conferences from September that will be going live shortly. They're free to members and non-members. It'd be great to see landlords and agents there. We're across Wales. I know we're going to Southampton in September as well. So check out the NRLA site, and I hope to see you at an event soon.
Fantastic. Ben, thank you again so much. It's been a real pleasure. And I guess let's cross our fingers and hope that the next few years look a bit better. Thanks, Ben.
All the best.